What do oil, doctors, and a kitchen window have in common? You're about to find out in this fun-sized felony. Welcome back to Forgotten Felonies. I'm Monica, and this is a fun-sized felony. Before we begin, no felony is ever fun. I call it fun-sized because this story is short, not because the crime is light or trivial. This story takes us to Indianapolis, Indiana in 1913 and introduces us to Dr. Charles M. Clayton. Now, before we get to the shooting itself, we need to talk about Dr. Clayton's romantic history because this story was strange long before anyone shot a gun. Several years earlier, a man named George Wilson became convinced that Dr. Clayton had stolen his wife. And truth be told, his wife had moved back in with her mother, and then Dr. Clayton moved in with them, and then a divorce happened within a couple months, and then Louise married Dr. Clayton just 3 days later. George Wilson sued Dr. Clayton for alienation of affections, claiming that the doctor had broken up his marriage. The case went to court, it dragged on for quite some time, and eventually a jury sided with Dr. Clayton. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, well, the timing of everything certainly raises some questions, you're not alone. Okay, people were asking those same questions in 1911, and I'm personally surprised that the jury sided with Dr. Clayton. But he was lucky because George Wilson was suing him for $10,000, which would have been a lot in 1911. Whatever had happened between Dr. Clayton and Louise, the lawsuit was over and their marriage was legal. Dr. Clayton settled into life as a successful physician, and his son, George, from his first marriage, was living with him and Louise. So Louise was in the role of stepmother now that she's married to Dr. Clayton. Witnesses later described Dr. Clayton as a man who took enormous pride in his home at 2305 Brookside Avenue. He spent his spare time planting flowers, tending vines, and improving the yard. He loved making his house look so beautiful. And by every account, he just adored that house. It wasn't anything magnificent, it was a modest home, but he just really loved this house. Now, his medical practice was thriving, his home was flourishing, and life seemed to be going exceptionally well. Then September 15th arrived. Around 11:30 a.m., Dr. Clayton drove home for lunch in his black roadster. So he was doing very well as a doctor. He was able to afford this automobile. Now that day, for whatever reason, he arrived home 30 minutes earlier than usual. Usually, Louise could expect he'd be home at noon, but he came home at 11:30. As he pulled up to the house, he noticed an oil wagon parked in the street in front of his house, blocking his driveway. Dr. Clayton was, in his black roadster, which he kept in the garage, but he couldn't get to the garage with this big wagon in his way. He pulled up alongside the wagon and saw that there was no driver in the wagon, and that seemed strange. He parked on the street and he walked to the back entrance of his house. As he stepped into the threshold, he saw a most disturbing sight. There, according to his testimony, he found oil wagon driver Joseph H. Stout standing in the kitchen with his arms around Louise. And Louise had her arms around Joseph Stout. And then Dr. Clayton realized they were kissing. Clayton testified that he demanded to know what Stout was doing there. He actually said, "What do you mean here, loving and kissing my wife?" Stout didn't answer, but he released Louise, he let go of her, and then he ran for the door. Dr. Clayton followed him, and when they were both outside the house, he fired his revolver, which he kept in his pocket. But it's interesting because he had purchased that revolver that month. But anyway, so he pulls out the gun and he shoots at him, and then he was chasing him. So Dr. Clayton follows him. He gets out into the yard. He tries to fire a second time, but the safety lock on the revolver caught, so it wouldn't fire again. And then by the time he had it ready to fire again, Stout had disappeared across a field. So Dr. Clayton went out to the street. He drove the oil wagon out of the way, and then he put his car in the garage where it belonged. Now, that one shot that was fired, it did indeed hit its mark. The bullet passed through Stout's left arm and then entered his chest. And the bullet traveled downward and actually wound up perforating his intestines. So, after parking in the garage, Dr. Clayton went back inside his house, and he was understandably very upset. And he said terrible things to Louise while she made excuses. Of course, oh, it's not what you think. And then Dr. Clayton telephoned the police to report the incident. The police came to his house, and the police told them, "You both need to get to the station." So the two of them got into Clayton's black roadster to drive to the police station to report what had happened. And on the way, Dr. Clayton hit a pedestrian. It was a 15-year-old boy named Roy Dietring, and he had to be rushed to the hospital, and it was feared that he was going to die. So this was crazy. The newspapers referred to Roy as the doctor's second victim. So Dr. Clayton and Louise continued on to police headquarters. I'm sure somebody helped with Roy, and the police listened to Dr. Clayton's story. They arrested him and they charged him with assault and battery with intent to kill. They also arrested Louise and they charged her with loitering. So I was thinking, this is so weird. I mean, did you not want her at the station? She's not leaving. What's going on? But apparently back then in 1913, loitering was a much more broad term than it is today. So they did not arrest her for hanging around where she shouldn't have been, but they arrested her for having engaged in inappropriate behavior. So basically, you were messing around and that's not okay. Because remember, adultery was like against the law back then. Anyway, inappropriate behavior. Dr. Clayton, when he's talking to the police and giving his statement, he said horrible things about his cheating wife. Blaming her for this, calling her names or whatever. Well, in another interrogation room, Louise Clayton was telling her own story. She said that she had been attacked by the oil man. She said he'd come in to try to get them to buy oil from their company again because Dr. Clayton had, according to Louise, switched to a different company the previous June. He stood on the porch talking with me. We had conversed about 10 minutes when he took a step toward me. He seized my hands and, with those strong arms, pulled me to him. He crushed me against him and called me endearing names. He kissed me often. "My, but you look sweet this morning," he said to me. I was afraid to scream. I did not want to arouse the neighborhood and bring the police and resultant publicity into our home. It was then that Dr. Clayton appeared in the doorway. I tried to explain, but he would not listen to me. As God as my judge, I never made advances or received them cordially from the wagon driver, whose name I did not even know. Louise apparently collapsed while discussing the incident. After the charges were filed and the statements were made, the Claytons were released on bond. They avoided the reporters who had gathered outside of the police station by that time, and they went out different doors. And then Dr. Clayton swung around in his car to pick up Louise when they were far enough away from the newsmen, and they both went to their home at 2305 Brookside Avenue. Eventually, the oil driver, Joseph Stout, he contacted a coworker and asked him to go back to the Clayton home to get his oil wagon and to, drive it to him. Well, the police, who already knew about all of this, they'd been watching the oil wagon, knowing that it would be the key to finding the third party in this whole fiasco. They followed the oil wagon when it was picked up, and this led them straight to Joseph Stout, who they also intended to arrest for loitering. But first, they took Joseph Stout back to the home of the Claytons. Now, apparently, when the police officer walked him inside, he said to Dr. Clayton that they should just hush up this whole thing because Stout is also married, and gosh, it sure would be a shame to have all this notoriety. Well, Dr. Clayton responded with something about, you broke up my family. You're in the hands of the law now. Next, Stout was taken to the city hospital because, remember, he had been shot. So the doctors didn't think that it was that serious, and then he was taken to the police station where he was charged with loitering. He was released on bond as well, and he went home to his pregnant wife. She was 2 months away from her due date. So he went home to his pregnant wife that evening. After Dr. Clayton was out of the jail, right, and he had some time to speak to Louise because they'd gone home together, he had a change of heart. He had even gone back to work and was taking patients throughout that evening. When a reporter stopped in to ask him questions, he said, "I was hasty. I'm going home to the wife who cooked my dinner for me today. I caught her in my automobile and we went home together. I had begun to cool down. I believe that my first statements made against her were not well thought of before they were spoken, but circumstances were so suspicious. It would only be fair and proper that I should allow her to prove to me that her actions were not to be criticized, and I shall do so. There will be no separation. My girl will take care of my home as she has done for 3 years." And at this point, I just want to say, sir, how generous of you. He's letting her come back so she can keep cleaning and cooking. That's fantastic. Now, although Stout was still, on his feet, he's able to walk. I assume he's able to drive an oil wagon. The wound was actually much more serious than they had imagined. So remember, the shooting was on September 15th. And that night, after he went back home, his wife realized that he was not looking so good. Like he was declining. So she took him back to the hospital. He was admitted, and doctors did their best to try to find the bullet to remove it. They use words like probed for the bullet, and I just imagine them sticking fingers inside this hole, which seems terrible. But anyway, it became clear to them that, first of all, they couldn't find the bullet, and his intestines had been perforated by the shot. So they were very concerned, he's probably going to die. They were like, if it did perforate the intestines, I mean, you might as well say your goodbyes now. 2 days later, on Wednesday, September 17th, around 3:30 in the morning, Joseph Stout died at St. Vincent's Hospital. Then Dr. Clayton was arrested again, and this time it was for murder. He was beside himself, and he wound up collapsing in his cell from a nervous breakdown. At first glance, this case seemed simple. A husband comes home unexpectedly, finds another man embracing his wife, and violence follows. Like, end of story. But there's more to this story. First of all, I just want to say, while he was in jail from September through February when his trial took place. And basically, he was almost treated like a hero. It was very interesting. He was allowed free reign of the jail. He could go wherever he wanted to. And also, he was painting the walls. He was redecorating and painting inside the jail. And the sheriff said that he had saved the county about $100 with all of this work. And then it turns out later, he actually was being let out of the jail. He could go wherever he wanted. Like he didn't even have to stay in there. And when they were trying to choose a jury, the potential jurors were saying things like, "Oh yeah, I know him. He came into my shop just a few days ago." So you can imagine the prosecutor was probably just so mad because this guy's supposed to be in jail. He's, being tried for murder. I mean, the prosecutor was going for the death penalty. So anyway, he's in jail, and now it's time to build a case, and get this in front of a jury. Dr. Clayton and his defense team changed his story a little bit. If you remember, initially Dr. Clayton told the police that Joseph Stout had run out of the house, right? He was chasing him. He shot him as he was running. But now that he's possibly going to be executed, the story changed to Joseph Stout coming at him, quote, like a bulldog. He said Stout had reached his right hand down toward his pocket as if he were going for a weapon. So the argument was self-defense. The prosecution immediately took the position that Joseph Stout had not been attempting to attack Dr. Clayton at all. Instead, they argued that Stout was running away when he was shot, which, I think he probably was running away when he was shot because that was his signed confession when he was talking to the police. So they're saying, no, he shot him while he was running. And they even had an expert come up to prove, to give testimony, saying that the wound had been sustained while he was running away, from the back. The prosecution said, this had been planned. That's what they wanted to prove, that this was all premeditated. They said that when he saw the oil wagon without a driver, then he would have known the driver was in the house, and therefore he would have, at that moment, decided what he was going to do. So it's premeditation. He knew. The prosecution also intimated multiple times that they would prove Dr. Clayton had received a phone call from a friend telling him, giving him a heads up. And that's why he went home for lunch early that day. This never did come up in testimony. I didn't see anything in the papers to say this person actually said that, but the prosecution planted that seed in their opening arguments. The prosecution began with a very interesting angle. They said that all of this was the fault of Louise Clayton. Here is an actual quote from the opening statement. The state will show that Louise Clayton was a woman of loose morals and shifting affections. Now, she was in the courtroom for all of this. She was standing by her man. And yeah, she was hearing all of this testimony about just how crappy she was. Apparently, she looked down, like she was downcast, looked down, but she still sat there and listened. One witness called by the state was actually George Wilson, Louise's first husband. He testified to everything that had happened between them, how he and Louise had been happy up until she met Dr. Clayton, and he testified to the improprieties that took place and how she had been carrying on with the doctor behind his back. The state also brought in the statement that had been made by Joseph Stout himself before he died. He said that he was only there to collect a bill for $11. He said that Mrs. Clayton was joking with him, telling him to go away, and had raised her arms as if, shooing him, like, shoo, get out of here. And he said that he had only grabbed her arms, like, in return with the same joking manner, and that was it. Stout's boss, Walter G. Harris, he was supposed to testify for the state. He was going to say that he had given a statement of account against Dr. Clayton, so a bill was due. He had given it to Joseph Stout on September 14th, the day before the shooting. So apparently the Claytons had stopped using this oil company the previous June, and they had an outstanding bill that they just had never paid. So they were tired of it. So Joseph Stout was told, you need to go to their home frequently, like show up and keep asking about this until they pay this bill. This testimony was not allowed in by the judge. The defense said, this has nothing to do with anything. Someone was shot. Who cares if they owed money or whatever? But the state was trying to show that he had perfectly good reason to be at the Clayton home. So all of that would have made for a dramatic trial. That's great. But then the prosecution called a witness named Edna Myers, and suddenly the entire story changed. Mrs. Myers lived in the neighborhood of the Claytons, but her mother lived right next door to them. On the day of the shooting, she was visiting her mother, which she did very frequently, apparently, and she happened to be sitting near a window that overlooked the Clayton residence. It had a perfect view right into the Clayton kitchen. Now, when I first read that, I assumed that she just so happened to sit by that window and had simply glanced over at the perfect moment. But that was not the case. Mrs. Myers was a nosy neighbor, and she was watching the comings and goings of everyone, getting all the juicy secrets. This was like her version of a soap opera, okay? So she sat at that specific window for a purpose, and she just got her thrills, got her entertainment by tracking the activity of her neighbors. According to her testimony, Joseph Stout was not some random oil man who had happened to stop by that day to collect $11. He was a frequent guest at the Clayton home. Sometimes, she claimed, he visited twice a day. And more importantly, he never visited when Dr. Clayton was present. Well, then came the bombshell. Mrs. Myers testified that Stout had been inside the house for roughly half an hour before Dr. Clayton arrived. And during that time, she claimed, Stout and Louise were constantly hugging and kissing in the kitchen. They left the room together for several minutes and later returned to the kitchen. They hugged, they kissed, they embraced again, and according to Mrs. Myers, that's when Dr. Clayton arrived home. I can see it now. She's just watching the canoodling, right, in the Clayton kitchen. And then she sees Dr. Clayton approaching the house. And she knows that the people in the kitchen can't see Dr. Clayton, but she can see it all. I imagine she was so excited. She probably put down her knitting needles and leaned closer to the glass with anticipation, because this is the climax, right? She never thought this would happen, and she didn't want to miss it. She just had to make sure she didn't fog up the glass. So Edna Myers was the perfect witness. She was a prosecutor's dream. The prosecution now had a very different story to tell. This wasn't a sudden misunderstanding, like Mrs. Clayton insisted. This wasn't an attack on her, made by a man that she'd only ever seen once before in her life. This was evidence of an ongoing relationship. Meanwhile, the defense focused on the moment that Dr. Clayton walked through the door. Dr. Clayton took the stand, and he described finding his wife in another man's arms. He insisted that Stout had advanced toward him and appeared to be reaching for a weapon. He maintained that he fired only because he feared for his life and wanted to protect himself, his wife, and his home. Then came one of the most emotional moments of the entire trial. The defense produced a photograph of Dr. Clayton's home, the same home that he had spent years improving and beautifying. When the photograph was shown to him, Dr. Clayton completely broke down. According to newspaper reports, he sobbed openly on the witness stand. Jurors were even crying. They wiped away tears. Women in the audience were crying. Louise herself was crying when he was talking about the flowers they had planted together. At one point, Clayton told the jury that after discovering Stout with his wife, he felt as though he might go crazy and that it seemed as though his head would burst. And then there was Louise. Throughout all of this testimony, Louise sat in the courtroom listening. She cried, she watched, she heard witness after witness discuss her marriage, her past, and her relationship with Joseph Stout. But she never testified. The prosecution pointed to her silence and essentially asked, if her testimony helps the defense, why didn't they call her? The defense could have asked the exact opposite question. If her testimony helps the state, why didn't the prosecution call her? Louise remained silent, and the one person besides Clayton who truly knew what happened inside that kitchen never told the jury her version of events. By the time closing arguments arrived, the trial had become this huge public spectacle. The courthouse was literally overflowing. Newspaper reporters were describing that old soldiers were there, merchants, farmers, mothers carrying babies, school children, and curious townspeople, and they were all just crowding into this room. Some men literally climbed into the windows to watch, and so it was really stuffy in there, and the jurors requested fresh air. So one newspaper called the trial, quote, the last act in the life drama of Dr. Charles M. Clayton. And it's not a bad description. What makes this case so fascinating isn't simply the shooting, it's the irony. Years earlier, another man had stood in court accusing Dr. Clayton of stealing his wife and asking for $10,000 in damages. A jury sided with Dr. Clayton, and then just a few years later, Dr. Clayton came home and found another man embracing that very same wife in his own kitchen. On February 28th, 1914, the jury deliberated for a full 5 minutes, and the verdict was read exactly 5 minutes after that. He was not guilty. He was free to go. That was a Friday. He went straight back to his home at 2305 Brookside Avenue. The next morning at 8 o'clock a.m., he went to work in his office in the United Building. He stayed there until 9 p.m. that night, so that was a 13-hour workday. He was visited by a reporter, and he said to the reporter that he will continue to practice medicine in Indianapolis, and with his wife and son, he will continue to live at 2305 Brookside Avenue, the home that he loves so much. He made that statement to the reporter for the Indianapolis Star on March 1st of 1914, and by March 14th, the house was listed for sale. The ad is printed in large capital letters so it stands out on the page, and it reads, "For sale at a bargain, my home, 2305 Brookside Avenue, Dr. C. M. Clayton, 11-12 United Building. I couldn't find anything that said they got divorced, but clearly something had changed in those 2 weeks. And that's the story of Dr. Charles M. Clayton, a physician who beat an alienation of affection lawsuit, built what he believed was the perfect home, came home early one day for lunch, and within minutes found himself facing the worst day of his life. Whether he acted in self-defense, rage, heartbreak, or some combination of all three, it's something people debated in 1914. Was it karma for stealing George Wilson's wife? That's what comes to my mind. Oh, and that 15-year-old boy, Roy Dietrich, he made a full recovery. This has been a fun-sized felony.